I always wanted to rewrite that Hashgraph algorithm in Rust. And so I did it. Maybe we need to create a company called Tashi that's going to solve like real world Web 2 problems using Web 3 tech. Hey, there's a high demand for your computer right now. If you hit this button, you'll get a 20% bonus.
All right, everyone. Hello, and welcome back to a very special episode of the Unleashing DePIN Podcast. We are here live at ETH Denver. So this is a different background than we get to do. This is an in-person podcast. We are here with Ken from Tashi, which is a very awesome DePIN project we are quite excited about. Ken, welcome to the Unleashing DePIN Podcast at ETH Denver. How are you doing?
Dude, I am so honored to be here. I'm like flattered that you would have me here.
I couldn't have thought of a better project because I love what you're building. So maybe for the folks that are listening, can you just give a quick introduction about yourself, your background in the space, and then we can start chatting about Tashi from there?
Sure. Yeah. I'm a software architect by trade, spent years in the telecommunications space, trying to figure out how to improve telecom integration, software type stuff. And at one point decided to start my own company. This was like 15 years ago, started a company doing consulting for startups. And at one point I had a company, this was in 2015, 2016, that was like, late 2016, actually. They were like, yeah, we want to build this app. You guys are building it for us, but we want to figure out how to take advantage of this ICO thing and raise some money. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh no, but we got to find like a real use case, dude.
Yeah.
Like not just ICO. And he's like, yeah, you figure out the use case. I'll figure out the ICO part. And I'm like, all right. So I remember looking around and being like, what types of functionality is available in EOS, Ethereum, all the projects that were around back then. And there really wasn't anything that fit organically into the app until I ran into Hashgraph.
Okay.
And then I was like, okay, this Hashgraph thing might work, the swirled SDK. And we started playing with it. I met the owners, we talked a bit. And at one point I put a proposal out to them and I said, hey, can we rewrite the Hashgraph algorithm in Rust? Because it was in Java. I was like, there's so much we could do with this algorithm. And they said, yes, but not right now. We got too much stuff committed to our investors. Let's build this project. By the way, would you like to come on and be our developer evangelist? And I said, I won't be your developer evangelist, but if we cross out the word evangelist and put advocate in there, I'll do that.
As long as you put Rust on the roadmap, is that, yeah.
Well, and that wasn't a condition, but that was like always in my mind. That was always the hope of what I was building. And so I came on as their chief developer advocate. I built out their entire DA team, helped with council recruitment for all the $1 billion plus companies that joined Hedera, because that eventually became the Hedera project, the Hedera blockchain. They hate it when I say blockchain. It's a DLT because it's not actually technically a blockchain, but I think blockchain describes all the DLTs. It's synonymous these days.
Yep.
And I spent 3.5 years with Hedera doing that. And then when I left, I had to leave for personal reasons and then took a year off and then came back and was like, okay, what am I going to do now? And I thought, you know what? I always wanted to rewrite that Hashgraph algorithm in Rust. And so I did it. I put together a team. We rewrote it in Rust. We changed it significantly in the tuning process and optimization. So it was no longer technically like the actual Hashgraph algorithm. It was something different, but like we're standing on the shoulders of giants here, right? And so I want to make sure I give credit where credit is due. And we were like, where can we use this consensus algorithm that allows like 30 to 50 milliseconds of latency of peer-to-peer connectivity for finality on transactions? And we did a POC on a game to see if it worked for like live multiplayer gaming, and it worked. And we were like, wow, this worked so well. Maybe we need to create a company called Tashi that's going to solve like real world Web 2 problems using Web 3 tech.
Nice.
So that's the origin story of Tashi, like where I came from. If we go even further back, it depends on how far you want to go back. Like I was an interrogator in the army for a number of years. I served a mission in Korea and learned how to speak Korean. And so by the time I was 25, I had a whole lifetime behind me.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story. Do you use those interrogation tactics in your interviewing process now? For people that maybe want a job at Tashi, is that you confirm or deny?
I don't think you ever can get rid of those skills.
All right.
But I think where I use it more now is I can recognize when people are using those things on me.
That's a helpful skill.
Yeah. And then I just smile when I see somebody using it on me. I'm just, all right, I see what you're doing.
I love that. I love that. You wanted to build the Hedera basically consensus mechanism in Rust that's going to create a lot of performance as you alluded to. Why focus on gaming services first? What was the initial kind of clarity point for you when it came to Tashi going after that vertical specifically?
Yeah, that's a great question. Quite frankly, it was our POC. And we were like, let's prove that this algorithm is like performant and sufficient to meet real technical requirements for real-time applications. And gaming was our POC. So we said, oh, that worked with gaming. That was awesome. But then what we realized is like there's very little regulation in gaming. So it's a low risk industry. As we were doing our research, the gaming infrastructure space for multiplayer gaming is like a $45 billion industry. So we're looking at this going, okay, it's a big industry. A lot of games are going out of business right now because they can't afford their server costs. We could legitimately take the server costs out of multiplayer games and we become the lifeline for games. And we're like, not only is there a giant TAM here, not only is there like a real Web 2 value fit for a Web 3 innovation, but it's critically urgent. These game developers need this technology. Otherwise they're going out of business. When your option is go out of business or integrate with Tashi, that's a pretty compelling forcing function for a project.
I love it. I love it. And talk to me a little bit about, for people that maybe don't understand exactly what Tashi is, you have the consensus, but there's also a services layer deep in that's really integral to your go-to-market. I think that's one of the reasons you guys are differentiated in the space. Talk to me about what some of those kind of core infrastructure services are, what that maybe means for game developers, or is that game infra market for people to just contextualize that within their mental model?
Yeah. So there's really two parts to Tashi, right? One of them is the Tashi consensus engine, which enables peer-to-peer multiplayer gaming without servers and without blockchain nodes. Just literally, it's an SDK that drops into Unity or Unreal, and the game has the consensus protocol baked into it. So the peers, while they're playing their game, are part of the consensus protocol. They're validating and synchronizing with each other at 30 to 50 milliseconds of latency. So there's a little bit of latency, but it's low enough that most games are satisfied. So that's the first piece, is that consensus engine. And that one quite literally is saving 100% of server costs for multiplayer gaming. So that's a massive deal. But then there's this other side that is like all the cloud gaming infrastructure services like matchmaking and lobby and in-game chat and all these services that currently are in the cloud or like AWS. We can move those to the edge and they can actually reinforce and make more reliable these game sessions. So we're moving cloud game infrastructure into a DePIN model where we're incentivizing the node operators with real revenue that is currently funneling towards these cloud services. So if you look at the two products, you got the gaming infrastructure DePIN and the consensus engine. We're removing the server costs completely, and we think we can cut the cloud infrastructure costs in half for a total potential effect of 50 to 60% savings on Web 2 game infrastructure using Web 3 tech.
That's huge.
And I want to make sure that's different. Like, we're not catering towards Web 3 games.
Right.
We're solving a Web 2 problem with a $45 billion TAM. That if we're successful, we bring that down to, say, a $20 billion TAM. And even if we get 1% market penetration, that's a $200 million ARR. That's a pretty good starting point.
One of the things that I really appreciate about you guys is that you're super intentional on solving a problem that exists today, as you mentioned, too. The TAM is huge. But those services are services that developers are already paying for. So you can completely reduce that cost and enable them to do not only a better game, but you can also save them from potentially going extinct or going out of business. And so the market's there. It's not like you're speculating on demand side viability. Right. It's there today.
Yeah. And I think, in the Web3 space, it's an amazingly innovative space. And I see a lot of people who are like, I'm going to invent something cool and people are going to come and the market's going to develop around it. And maybe I can justify that market with a small sample size and say, oh, look, this sample size of $100,000 of revenue justifies that this is valuable. But now we got to go out and build the market off of that $100,000 that we validated our product with. We're going the other way around. We're going, oh no, there's already a $45 billion problem that we think we can cut in half or more. So we're like the opposite direction of starting with the revenue and the business and then coming back and solving it using Web3 tech.
And the other thing that I think is really compelling about your go-to-market plan is that you're meeting developers where they're already at today by integrating the SDK into things like Unity, like into these gaming engines that developers are leveraging today. Can you talk about, if you're a developer, what that onboarding or integration process looks like?
That's an amazing question, because I actually had, by the way, we just brought on Taisu last night as
congratulations,
one of our VCs.
Some alpha dropped on the pod.
Nobody knows about this yet. You guys just learned it. We just brought on Taisu, but one of their post-IC questions last night was like, aren't developers going to have to learn new technology and a new way to build, and like, how are you going to overcome that friction? And it was a great question, because I think that's totally relevant. When you go to the Web 2 guys and you're like, oh, by the way, you got to install this Solidity SDK or this EVM SDK.
Yeah.
And you got to change how you think about game development. You're adding friction to the process. What we built in our SDK is a package that installs in Unity, and we're working on the Unreal one right now. But if you've ever built a game in Unity and you do a multiplayer, you've got this thing called Network Manager that supports all multiplayer network relationships, or actually all network relationships between the client and the server. When you install the Network Manager, it has a dropdown that by default has two options. It's server client and host client. Those are the two options you have. When you install our package, it just adds a third option that says Tashi Mesh Player or MeshNet. So it's literally the exact same thing they're doing in Unity today, just adds a third dropdown.
That workflow is just seamless and it works the way they already know.
In an ideal scenario, game developers don't change any behaviors.
Right.
They take their credit card, they go to our dashboard, they swipe their credit card, they get an API key, they install the SDK, and it works right into their existing pipeline. And they don't even know that they're using Web3 other than, okay, the service actually seems to be better in certain scenarios, and I'm saving a ton of money, so I can actually afford to scale the product.
Yeah.
But to them, no behaviors change.
Which is so crucial to adoption. That's one of the things that I think DePIN has a high chance of doing well.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you see some of these projects, but a lot of times when you bring the Web3 stuff in, there's so much friction because the adoption curve is just, it's too much of a barrier to entry. And you're completely the opposite of that, which I think is amazing.
And in most Web3, there's two key friction points. The first one is key management, and the second one is on-ramp.
Yep.
On and off-ramp, right? We can abstract all of that away for game players. The cool thing is because we're doing DePINs, we have two sides of the market, right? We've got the demand side, which is just using credit cards and API keys, and don't need to know that there's a Web3 side, and node operators, which are like Web3 degens, right? So they're happy managing keys and all of that stuff.
Right.
So we get to leave all the Web3 stuff to the degens, the node operators, and we get to hide all of the Web3 friction away from the end user, the developers and the players.
Yeah. I love that. I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the other verticals that you're able to service with this, because you do extend beyond gaming. But for people that are maybe tracking kind of the DePIN gaming space, you're complementary, I would say, to the other projects that are out there. You're an enabler or maybe an integration partner. Can you talk about how you're seeing the other, maybe just Web3 gaming in general, but your maybe partner opportunity within the space or maybe within DePIN? Is that something you can talk about a bit?
Yeah, I'll say something really controversial that I think everybody knows, but nobody wants to say. Like, Web3 gaming is a failed experiment. It's fully on-chain gaming. If you're in the fully on-chain gaming development space, I think there's a niche. There's a category of people who are okay with fully on-chain games that like to participate in that. It's not a mainstream solution. Same thing with play to earn and ownership of your assets. People don't care. Players want to play their game. And if the game goes away, they don't care if their assets go away. In most cases, people really don't care. Now, that being said, the Web3 community shows that there are a group of people who do really care about that stuff, and that's fine. But let's not pretend that this is solving a Web2 problem. That's the first part, right? Is like, whenever we talk to people and we say, yeah, we're doing infrastructure in Web3 gaming, they're like, oh no, Web3 gaming has failed, we're not interested.
Yeah.
But that's not what we're doing. We're using Web3 tech to solve a Web2 problem. Now, that being said, there is an audience for those other things.
Sure.
So we need to make sure that we're integrating with those things. When I say failed experiment on the Web 2 audience, right? There's still the Web 3 audience that wants to play that. So we're integrating with all the major L1s and L2s to allow asset movement on and off. We even are able to integrate on a state proof level. So you can actually take the game of the state signed by all the players and pass that into a smart contract. So you can do things like prediction markets or other types of asset allocations on chain based off the state of the game.
Yeah.
We can't ignore that there is still value in those things and people care about that. It's just not the mainstream gaming use cases that's solving for, but we're making sure that those can still be fulfilled.
Right. You're an enabler, but you're not required or you're not dependent on those to be successful. I think that's really interesting. Talk to me about other services that you can enable or lock outside of the gaming infrastructure market. Because I think this is one of the things that's really compelling. You have a very clear go-to-market plan with a known TAM, but you also can service things like AI or other real-time applications. How are you thinking through that at Tashi?
So the funny thing is like our current revenue is coming from a non-gaming use case.
Okay.
So we have $100,000 a year right now in revenue that was just from a derivative POC. So we took our consensus algorithm and we built something called FoxMQ, which is a decentralized message queue. And if you're familiar with IoT, MQTT being the protocol, we're MQTT version 3 and 5 compatible, but you can take this FoxMQ and go use it to solve IoT problems where you want to have multi-master message queues, which really doesn't exist today. There are projects that try to do it and they do a horrible job of it and it's very expensive, but we're just doing multi-master message queues. Another one we've been looking at, and some of these discussions are like DoD style contracts, is like multi-master databases. Our protocol can solve that. The DePIN services can support all of those use cases. So we're talking about like databases and message queues, which live under every single application you use. Everybody here who's using Uber or Postmates or whatever, DoorDash, there's a message queue before it gets to their database. And we support all of those use cases. The actual TAM of Tashi is massive. And the DePIN side adds resilience and support for those use cases. Our DePIN service layer, maybe something that differentiates us from most other DePINs is that most other software DePINs, I should say, most other software DePINs are exposing storage or compute for general use. We're focusing on very specific use case services. So you're going to have a message queue or real-time chat, or maybe a database connector that allows you to have multi-master databases for Postgres. These are services that are very intentional and have a very clear functional implementation strategy, not just generic compute and generic GPU and generic storage.
I think that right there is just, it's hard to understate how important that is, or how valuable it is from a viability standpoint. Because there's a lot of the projects, there's commoditized resources that don't have that additional driver of value that would make it compelling for developers or businesses to say, this is why I want to integrate it within our solution. You solve the other component of it, which is frankly missing, which is the services piece, right?
Absolutely. There's been some plays like with data availability, what Zero G did with their key value store. To me, that's an incredibly valuable service. A key value store is useful in almost every tech stack. So I look at that, I'm like, okay, they did a good job. There's like a useful service that I can plug into my project today and I'm good to go. But if you're like, oh, we're going to do general compute, I'm like, what does that interface look like? And like, how does that work better than Google Cloud or DigitalOcean or whatever?
Yeah.
And quite frankly, I don't mind spending a couple bucks on DigitalOcean every month to test things out. There's still questions about privacy and security. And I know a lot of projects are trying to highlight that, but a lot of that hasn't panned out yet.
Yeah.
I'm still struggling with the general compute use case because I'm a developer myself and I'm deploying stuff. If somebody built like a Vercel or like a Netlify that was completely decentralized, and maybe Flux has already done this, right? Maybe I'm just like pretending like this doesn't exist and I'm just not as familiar with the projects as I need to be. But that to me would be like the killer project, provided that the security is there.
Talk to me about the DePIN services layer, because I think a lot of people that listen to the podcast, they want to become node operators. They want to get their hands dirty with these different projects. What does it look like to be a node on the Tashi network?
Yeah, so it's an install. Our requirements are very low. We can run, we're testing on Raspberry Pis right now, Raspberry Pi 4 and 5. So it can run on almost any architecture. We've got even some Qualcomm chips that we're working with right now for some very specialized compute. But the point is, if you have one core or actually one thread of compute and 32 megs of RAM, 32 megabytes of RAM, you can at least run one parallel service with Tashi. And the more of those you have, the more parallel services you can run with Tashi. So you install the SSH, it's an SSH, it's an SH. So it's a bash script right now that it uses Docker to install and all that stuff. So it's like a walkthrough process of installing it onto your device. And once it's installed, you register it with your wallet so that you now have the license NFT attached to that device. And then you're going to start earning. So as long as your device is up and running, we're going to be looking for availability and passing jobs to those devices to do those jobs. And then every time you complete a job, you get a work point. And then at the end of the day, we calculate up your relative work points relative to everybody, figure out against the revenue, what the revenue share should be. And then you get distributed your revenue based off of that strategy.
That's amazing.
It's a very straightforward math calculation from revenue to node operators making money.
Yeah, which is what it should be, right?
Yeah. And the more threads you have and the more memory you have, the more parallel processes you can support.
Yeah.
So it can be really tiny and you can run it on phones, or it can be really big and run on enterprise server architecture. And either one, it's great.
No, I think that's awesome. And then when it comes to the work points, part of that availability is location dependent, right? Can you unpack how maybe being in Australia versus being in America differentiates you from participating and providing these services?
Yeah, no, that's great. So there's our whole thing with our tokenomics is aligning the incentives with the optimal outcome. There are certain services that are latency sensitive, and there are certain services that aren't. Matchmaking is not totally latency sensitive. We can have 300 milliseconds of latency and it's fine. Chat, not even really super latency sensitive, but real-time reverse proxy of a game player, like somebody who doesn't have a public IP address and we need to grab one of these nodes to be your representative in this session, is incredibly latency sensitive. So we want to have sub 20 millisecond network latency between the node and the player. So that being said, certain services are fine to run anywhere and everybody's going to get selected to do that. But certain services, we're going to be like, we're not going to match somebody in Australia with a player in the US.
Yeah.
But if we have high demand in Australia for these reverse proxy services or consensus services on one of our agents, one of our nodes, then what we do is through the tokenomics, we actually will give you a bonus if the ratio between demand and supply is higher than the supply to demand. We actually have a whole bonus infrastructure, or a bonus incentive built into our tokenomics that says, hey, listen, we've got a high ratio in Australia right now. If you stand up a node or turn on your computer during that time period in Australia, you'll earn a 20% bonus on your incentives for participating in those activities.
I love that. You're definitely thinking through at a very strategic level how you can continue to make the services as valuable for these game players and developers simultaneously, which is...
And I imagine it's a background running service. So if you're like using your computer for work and you're not playing games yourself and you're just like, you just don't have the Tashi node on because you're just not thinking about it. And then a pop-up comes up and says, hey, there's a high demand for your computer right now. If you hit this button, you'll get a 20% bonus. And they just go, yeah, run that in the background. Use the 15 cores I'm not using right now to do that. I'm just sitting here doing some work or browsing the internet. Go for it, use it. And so it'd be cool. It's going to be like, hey, earn more money with your node. Even though you're using it, we just need these threads in this memory to go do this other stuff.
Yeah. Is there a possibility where game players themselves can be nodes in the network? Is that, because obviously if you can install it, you can be a node operator on your computer, but is there a future state where developers can actually push the node running capabilities into a game interface that players are running?
Yes. Yeah, actually, that's the culmination of everything we're doing, is that players become part of the same economy and economic benefit that the entire infrastructure space is. So the whole thing about pushing things to the edge is that we're not just pushing compute to the edge, we're pushing the economic opportunity to the edge as well, right? So that's the ultimate state we want to get to. Now, how that plays out is still to be determined, but the vision I have is that we've got like a Steam-like launcher that you run your games in as a player. So you launch your games from here. And as a developer, I can say, I want to share my revenue from this player's node with the player, or I want to take it as a developer. And as a developer, I'll incentivize them with other things like in-game loot crates points and whatever in-game. And so the idea here is theoretically, game developers could create a new revenue stream. And they just basically tell the players, hey, listen, it's an opt-in only. You've got the launcher installed. If you leave your computer on and let me use it to support other games in the ecosystem, then I'm going to reward you with in-game points. So the players are going like, oh, I'm done playing my game for the 4 hours I was going to play it. Yeah, I'll just leave my computer on for the next 20 hours. And tomorrow I come in and I've got 3 loot drops. And they're just like, cool, keep playing. And now the developer has a new revenue stream because they're earning all of that node operator rewards from that player's machine staying on. Yeah. Alternatively, you could go the other route and say the developer wants to split that with the player and says, hey, leave your machine on. I'll give you half of my rewards. Now the player's playing their game and they get points in the launcher, and now they can use those points to buy new games in the launcher.
Sure. Dealer's choice as to how they roll that out.
Exactly. It's really up to the developer to decide because, again, we want to make sure the developer economics make sense so that games can keep getting built
and continue to survive.
That's right.
I want to talk to you a little bit about the roadmap, but before we do that, one of the questions I asked or wanted to ask was, you talked about being able to save a lot of costs for these developers with servers and whatnot, but what are the other kind of maybe gaming vertical specific benefits? Like you talked about these reverse proxies like in Australia. Are there other things related to cheating or just problems that developers and players alike face that you're able to solve through your consensus engine?
Yeah, I think DePIN and Consensus Engine, they support each other. They're both part of the same Tashi family, but they're really 2 separate problems we're solving, but they support each other. The consensus product, if we look at what the value propositions are of just the consensus piece, what we call player meshes, this player mesh SDK. This player mesh SDK really has three major value propositions. The first one is obviously the server savings, which we talked about, saving costs on servers. The second one is actually an anti-cheat mitigation potential. And the idea is that netcode is one of the hardest things to write in multiplayer gaming. Like, how do you write code that mitigates network hiccups, latency differences, all of those things? The problem is when you write netcode, you're announcing to the world, what are your exploits? What are your potential exploits? Players will sometimes exploit that. So if you write netcode that says, hey, I want the person with the highest latency to have good experience, so I'm going to shift the experience towards the people in favor of the people with high latency. What you have is this opportunity for people to come in and go, oh, I can fake high latency. I do what's called lag switching or lag spiking or lag griefing. And it allows me to rubber band around the map for other players. For me, it just looks like I'm running around the map. But to other players, you're here 1 second and then you're here the next second. And I can't get a good shot on you because you keep bouncing around the map. And it's because you've learned how to turn your latency up, on and off over and over again. So there are certain types of network hacks that exist for cheaters that our algorithm completely inoculates. It basically says, listen, we're only going to move you when you receive a valid move input. So if you're telling me you were here, and now you're telling me you're here, and you don't have a valid move input in between, you're just moving like this. So instead of rubber banding, you're actually like walking really slowly and becoming an easier target.
You're actually hindering their ability to cheat.
That's right.
That's
so we're
awesome.
mitigating that kind of cheat, and we're also mitigating the state manipulation cheat. So in host-client model, hosts can change the state of the game because they're the host, right? They're hosting in memory. With the consensus protocol, it requires at least 2/3 of the players to agree on the state before any state is changed. So that being said, there's no single person that has the ability to change state without everybody else detecting it and preventing it. If anything, you're going to ostracize yourself from the state of the game.
Right.
You're going to be like, okay, cool, I have all this gold, and everybody else is going to see you without having that gold. Or, oh, I've got this extra life, and everybody else says, no, he doesn't have that extra life, we're good.
Yeah.
So we actually solve a cheating problem. And so that's the second thing. The third and final thing, which is what is really exciting to me, which kind of goes back to the Australia example, is the fact that in certain parts of the world, they're far from the servers that would normally be supporting their multiplayer session. If I'm in Indonesia trying to play with my neighbors Call of Duty, we all have to be talking to the Philippines or Japan servers, which is going to add 100+ milliseconds of network latency,
Right.
pinging from my server to the dedicated server back to my friend who lives right next door to me. But what if we were able to just go from friend to friend?
Yeah.
And no server? Now we're actually improving the game experience for people as they get further away from what would have been the server data centers. There's actually a game improvement potential. Yes, we add 30 to 50 milliseconds of latency on consensus, but if we're removing 200 milliseconds of network latency, the net is positive for the players.
Absolutely. It's a net positive across the board, which is one of the things that is, I just love that your approach solves that in a way that it's financially beneficial. It makes it easy for the developers, and players also are incentivized to want to have this because everybody can empathize with a game that they've played where you're either getting like a super high ping and you're just getting destroyed. It takes all the fun out of gaming, or let alone cheating. Cheating's kind of ruined games in a lot of respects. So what's the roadmap look like then for node operators being able to come into the network and participate on the supply side with Tashi?
Yeah, so we're closing up our seed round right now. So we're hoping to close this out in the next month. But the goal with that, the seed money, is specifically to continue to build out the DePIN, the node operator part. So we've got the node operator dashboard we've got to finish building. We've just finished up with design on that, so we're going into development on that. We've got some of the selection and rewards algorithms that we're finishing up on coding right now. We've got to bundle the node operator software to be easier to be used. So right now it's just a bash script. So if you're smart enough and you know your computer stuff well enough, you're computer savvy, you can figure out how to install. I think most people in the space can install a bash script. So I'm not super worried about that one. But at some point, we want to have a desktop installer. So that's the next phase of the node operator side. But we're taking this money to build out those pieces. And then the next part to that is we have to have 1 or 2 kind of pilot games. We got 50+ games in the pipeline who are actively building on Tashi, but we need 1 or 2 of them to be in production. So we can be like, hey, you want to know what we do? Go download the game and play it. That's all running on Tashi. That's what we need, is that next step. We've got lots in the pipeline, but we need to use this money to really handhold the best of the games and get them through that process so everybody can see that benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you do launch, you've got like an AlphaNet, if I'm not mistaken, and then you'll have a primary mainnet launch. what services will be available on the DePIN network side that developers could interact with when the network does go live?
Yeah, so the AlphaNet is more about the installation script and the selection, job selection, and reward mechanisms. So the AlphaNet it's an unincentivized test net that it's an optional thing. We're encouraging people to come help us work out all the bugs of the selection algorithm and the rewarding algorithm. That's going to be our AlphaNet. We're going to have a beta net or a beta test net that's going to come out after that in the next few months. So AlphaNet's going to come out probably in the next month. So anybody can opt in and just start running one of our nodes. There's no incentivization. It's just help us streamline the selection process is really the big algorithm we want to solve for. The beta testnet is our incentivized testnet, which should come out in the next few months. And that's going to have services running. The first services that we're going to be running are the message queue and the reverse proxy.
Okay.
And so people are going to be able to start earning from that. It's going to be a little bit at first. We're going to subsidize some of that with our token. So we're going to be able to help encourage adoption using our token as part of the tokenomics. We expect our production mainnet to come out sometime this summer.
Okay.
And at that point, we'll have a list of services that will be available. We'll be in full swing. The goal is by the time we hit mainnet, we've got those 1 to 2 pilot games already actively using it, pushing traffic. And then additionally, we've got all these other games that are going to be testing and also pushing traffic. So there's a lot of stuff that leads up into that mainnet. So this summer should be somewhere in midsummer. We should have our mainnet up and running with a number of services that people are getting like real-time rewards for.
Yeah.
Additionally, we're going to continue to subsidize from our treasury because we want to make sure that, like, we get it. We're bootstrapping this, right? We want to make it worth it for the operators. The cool thing is you don't have to install hardware.
Yeah.
There's nothing magical you have to do. Hopefully by then we'll have the desktop installer. That's really the cutoff for production mainnet is that there's a desktop installer. And when we have that desktop installer, anybody should be able to download it and hit install. It runs down in the little bar in the side, and now you're earning money.
Yeah.
When you're not using a computer.
Yeah, I love that. And you alluded to this a little bit, but can you give a high level understanding of how the revenue from these game developers translates into earnings for node operators at all? High level. I know nothing's been publicized or anything. Can you just?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I can share some of this. I do want to be really careful about what I do share.
That's fine.
But let's just say what we're trying to do is to be as tax efficient and tax optimized as possible for our node operators. So that being said, what we're going to be doing is when revenue comes into the top of the DePIN from the developers, it goes into the treasury as a revenue that is controlled by the decentralized governance that we're going to be setting up. But it gets translated into reward points. So like loyalty points. And node operators are going to get rewarded in these loyalty points. And the allocation towards node operators, half of it's going to get issued directly in loyalty points, and the other half is going to be allocated to an incentive pool. If you wanted to take those loyalty points and cash them out to USD, USDC, or Tashi, you can do that at any time at a 1-to-1 value of whatever that dollar value was at the time.
Okay.
Because loyalty points have to be pegged to the dollar. They have to be pegged to a value. But the idea is like when you get that loyalty point for contributing your assets and now getting this loyalty point for participating, the loyalty is that you're participating in our DePIN and not other DePINs. So if you're loyal to our DePIN and you're operating, you're getting these loyalty points. When was the last time you got taxed on your loyalty points?
Never, thanks to some legislation that was passed to make it so that credit card points and other things like that are non-taxable.
Exactly. So the idea is you can accumulate these loyalty points. You can use them in net without ever accumulating or triggering a tax event, right? If you're buying things in the Tashi ecosystem or in any of our partner ecosystems, which is what we're trying to do with all of the other DePINs.
Yep.
But if you buy anything using those points in Tashi or one of our partner ecosystems, you don't get taxed on the earning and you don't get taxed on the spending. And I have to be really careful about how I say that because this is a loyalty point program. So this is the same way that this operates for flyer miles and credit cards and stuff like that. Now, that incentive pool that I said is 50% of the node allocation, the other 50% says, hey, listen, if you spend these loyalty points in network, you're going to get a reward from the incentive pool that is going to be a multiplier on what your spend is. So if I spend $100 worth of loyalty points, I'm going to get a percentage of that $100 back out of that incentive. Because what we want to do is we want to encourage economic turns in the loyalty program to grow that GDP. It's really creating economies here. If you cash out into Tashi and specifically stake that Tashi back to your node, which encourages additional security and also prioritizes you in the selection algorithm. But if you cash out to Tashi and then stake it to your node, you also can get a percent of that staked value back in rewards on the rewards program. So those are the two primary incentives that we want to focus on, is like in-network spending of loyalty points and staking of Tashi. Now, when you cash out to Tashi, you're going to trigger or redeem, I should say, redeem to Tashi, you're going to trigger a tax event.
Yep.
But because you're staking it, hopefully that new reward offsets that tax event. Right. So now you've got more points in network that you can use for other things in net. And then finally, I talked about incentivizing the high demand nodes. That's exactly where that percentage comes from, is out of that incentivization pool. So if your machine's not on and you're in Australia and we know you're in Australia and we have a high demand in Australia, we're like, hey, we're going to give you a 20% bonus for running in Australia. It comes out of that incentive pool.
Yeah. You've definitely thought through from so many different points of view, whether it's being able to have a redundancy in the network to be able to provide these services, also creating like an economy within the network itself, having the right incentive model behind that. It sounds like you guys have put a lot of thought into this, but you also said something that was interesting, which is that you can redeem these points in partner networks.
Yes.
What does that really mean? Because I don't think we've seen this in DePIN today.
We haven't. But look at the Star Alliance for airlines, right? When I earn points on my United flights, I can use that to stay at hotels or rent a car or buy additional flights on other airlines. I can use that. I can redeem those points for other rewards in other networks. And Brandon from Conduit would know the numbers off the top of his head, but the rewards program for the Star Alliance is something like 6 times larger than the size of United itself.
Wow.
The rewards networks are incredibly valuable and they're incredibly tax efficient. And they do that for a reason. And so we think of it that way. Tashi is the equivalent of United or whatever your favorite airline is, right? And we've got our own loyalty points. We've got our own reward points that we're going to offer in our network that you can use in our network. And then we've got partner networks like Star Alliance, where you can buy services from other networks and redeem those points in those other networks. And the cool thing is, when that economy gets large enough, I think it's something like $10 million in value between this Star Alliance partnership, we now can reach out to external rewards and loyalty programs. And now you can actually go buy flights and hotels and car rentals using the points you're earning on Tashi.
That's very
cool.
cool.
That's the big vision of like, how do we grow this DePIN economy?
Yeah. Are there other DePIN projects that you're looking at to be part of that initial kind of reward sharing network that you're able to talk about at all? Or
yeah, I mean, we talk about it pretty openly, and I think it's a work in progress, right? So the Council of Decentralized Economies, it's something that came out of the first DePIN Day in Seattle. And the initial kind of founding members were the Conduit Network, Tashi, Flux, IoTex, GeoNet, and NIFMIT. And so those are like the founding members. These are all the projects that are like, hey, we're DePIN projects. We're all going to have reward structure in our system. How can we integrate those rewards with each other? And so that's the start of it. It's growing. We've got a number of projects we're talking to right now to additionally join that. I'm not going to say who they are until they announce it, but there are some pretty cool projects, like big ones that everybody would know about. And soon you all know about Conduit and Tashi, and I hope everybody knows about Flux and GeoNet and IoTex.
Right.
But there's some pretty big projects that are joining this. But that code project, the Council of Decentralized Economies, CODE code, we've really got 2 primary objectives. The first one is to measure viability of the projects in DePIN, which is useful to investors and speculators and node operators to understand like the viability of these projects. But the second one is really like technical and economic integration. Technical integration is pretty straightforward.
Right.
Like, we all know how to do technical integration, but the economic integration is exactly what we're talking about here, which is that reward system.
That's very cool. I think there's a lot of potential that is yet to be tapped by combining these economies. For people that are interested in either becoming a node operator in AlphaNet when that's available, or they just want to get involved in Tashi in other ways, where are the best places for them to go to find that information?
The most direct place to go is tashi.network.
Okay.
So that if you're a node operator, you're interested, go to tashi.network. So that's the first place you would go to. You can also follow @Tashi Protocol on Twitter, X. And then if you want to follow me, you'll see my rants and ramblings and controversial posts on X. It's at Ken the Junior, KENTHEJR _V1, because I'm the first version of Ken the Junior. Somebody else grabbed that tag a long time ago. But that's where you can find me. If you don't remember my tag, you can always just go to our website or go follow Tashi Protocol, and I'm all over.
We're going to have all that linked below for folks to go
Amazing.
find it. Definitely worth checking out. Ken, I'm really excited about what you're doing. Is there anything else we didn't get a chance to chat about that you want to leave with folks before we wrap it up here?
Can I just leave it with like a controversial statement?
I'd love that.
Okay.
Bring on the controversy.
This might be too controversial. I might have to back off a little bit. I think what we're doing with DePIN in general is flipping the script on all of Web3. I think with Web3, we've been focusing on building cool tech. By the way, I love innovation, building cool tech. I think in the DeFi space, we've done a pretty good job of thinking about real world problems that we could solve with the technology. But for the most part, most technologies, like we're going to build a general use innovation and hopefully people come and use it. So it's been a one-sided market. DePIN's the opposite side of that. DePIN says you have to have two sides of this market. You have to have a demand side. We'll start with the demand and then build the supply. With Web3, traditionally, it's been let's build the supply and the demand will come.
Yeah.
I think DePIN is the next generation or the next evolution of Web3. I think a lot of layer ones and layer twos are going to have to really figure out where their position is in that space. Because while the rest of the world is going to be putting pressure on decreasing their expenditures on L1s, the DePINs are just going to keep growing. So L1s are going to have to start thinking, L1s and L2s are going to start thinking, how do we play nice with DePIN? And there might be some orchestration functionality that makes sense there, maybe some economic integration that makes sense. But I honestly, this is why I'm in the DePIN space. I think when you start with the demand and a real business model and a real TAM and a revenue opportunity, like you're going to be solving real world problems, and DePIN really is the on-ramp for all of Web 2.
Yeah. DePIN is the enabler to make the demand side capture way more likely valuable versus just building and they will come mentality that's we've seen in a lot of Web3 in general. And I appreciate that you guys are starting on the demand side.
I would argue that for the next few years, if you're not a DePIN project, or if what you're looking at to invest in is not a DePIN project, I would say you're probably on the wrong side of history.
I like that
That's
take.
my controversial take.
I would agree with your controversial take. I hope that doesn't become controversial in the future. Ken, I love what you guys are building. Like I said, I think you're trying for quite a bit of success. You've got a real problem set that you're going after, clear market, really clear execution between the DePIN layer and obviously the technology enabling that is so fascinating. So I wanted to thank you for coming on and doing a very special episode of the Unleashing DePIN podcast at ETH Denver.
This
Ken,
is amazing.
Oh, this is great. Ken, we'll wrap it up here. Please go check out everything that they're building at Tashi. Go to tashi.network. Go follow them on X. We'll have all that linked below. I think we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you for tuning in for this very special episode. And we will see you on the next one, not at ETH Denver, probably back in my home studio, but we will see you there. Thanks so much for tuning in.